Hi guys, we're back again. Still covering some things involving the resurrection since we're coming up with Easter. This one's not necessarily directly about the resurrection. This is about the New Testament because also at this time of year, we always get those people that say, well, how did the Bible get written, or excuse me, how did the New Testament get written by illiterate fishermen? All the disciples are illiterate fishermen. How could they have written the New Testament? Well, that's something we're going to cover today. But before I go any further, let me say thank you so much for watching. If you are here on YouTube, please hit subscribe down there. It sort of helps get things moving a little bit further, helps bump up things so that other people might see these things outside of the ones that followed me here from Facebook. So if you don't mind doing that, that'd be great. If you do mind doing that, I understand. Don't do it. But it's up to you. If there's anybody you think you should share this with, please do. I'm not doing this just for this. I feel like this is a message that a lot of people need, and I don't think I'm wrong about that. So if you could share this with other people, I mean, and go to people and say, hey, you need to see this. Go watch this. Watch. Not because of me, but if you see any value in these messages and you think anybody needs them, please, once again, share it. Let them know. That is our job here, to worship God, honor Him, glorify Him, and lead others to Him. And that's the goal of all this, is to lead and to give reasons and justification and evidence that we can believe. So here we go. This one is something we hear every single year around Easter time, that the disciples are just a bunch of illiterate fishermen, so how could they have written the New Testament? Well, let's talk about that for a second. Typically, they say, during this time, it's most people are illiterate. 90% of the people are illiterate this time. So how did the disciples do this? Well, first off, to randomly throw out a number like 90% of the people were illiterate is foolish because, one, we were not doing testing back then. We don't know. We make the assumption because there were not public schools on every corner. We make that assumption, but that is a grand assumption in Jewish community, and we're going to cover that and why in just a minute. But also, just because if it were true that 90% of people were illiterate, that doesn't necessarily mean that the disciples were. I can't just go on the street, pick out 10 guys and say, here's all 10 of you, and since 9 of you are illiterate, there's only one guy that can write. That's not the way you do math or reasons or statistics or percentages even. You can't, when you're doing statistical analysis of a demographic, you can't say, well, 90% are illiterate, so if I just randomly pick 10, one of them is going to be. You can say the odds are more in your favor to find an illiterate person out of a crowd than a literate person. That's all you can say. So you can't automatically say, well, there are 12 disciples, 90% were illiterate, so that means only 10 of them, or maybe 11, they weren't writing. If there's only one or two of them that could possibly write. That's not how statistics works. So let's look at the evidence of the people. Once again, let's look at the evidence. Let's don't look at the numbers. Let's don't look at our rationale. Let's don't look at our own understanding. Let's don't look at our own thinking. Let's look at the actual evidence. First off, let me just say, when they say this, my reaction is just ugh. Ugh. Just ugh. Because it doesn't look at a lot of facts. It makes one statement that's just kind of wacko, is that the 12 disciples who wrote the New Testament were all illiterate fishermen. Well, first off, most of the New Testament was not written by disciples. Matthew, John, James, and Jude, also known as Thaddeus, they were the only ones that were disciples. That's just 4. Most of the New Testament was not written by disciples. Mark was not a disciple. Luke was not a disciple. Paul was not a disciple. Not one of the original 12, anyway. People kind of throw him in as a disciple after the fact, but he was not those 12 that we're talking about. So let's cover them. Let's start at the beginning of the New Testament. Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector for the Roman government. Obviously, he had to keep records of who owed tax, how much they owed, who had paid, who had not paid. Couldn't be illiterate to do that kind of thing. Maybe he just knew numbers. Okay, I'll give you that. But in the book of Matthew, he quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel. And it is said that he might have written it in Hebrew, and then later it was translated into Greek. But this is a fact that's going to be referenced several times here coming up. Jewish children were all expected to memorize the first 5 books of the Old Testament by the age of 12. Memorize. Not read, memorize. Meaning they had to have read it, of course, unless, of course, somebody's just sitting there constantly saying it to them, constantly, and they're just hearing it and hearing it and hearing it. I think it's fair to say they were taught to read so that they could memorize 5 books of the Old Testament. I can't imagine me trying to teach my daughter to memorize the 5 books of the Old Testament and me not requiring that she read first. I'm sitting there constantly reciting it to her. Eventually, one of us had to be a reader to get there. So I would say that's strong evidence that maybe he wasn't illiterate, or maybe the Jewish children were not illiterate. There's no guarantee there. We don't know. We weren't testing then. So then it goes to stuff. That was Matthew. This is Mark. Mark was a scribe who was writing what Peter dictated to him. What scribes did? Scribes were the people who, if somebody wanted to write a letter, let's say they couldn't write it in the language they spoke, let's say one person spoke Aramaic, they're a Hebrew person, and they needed to write it in Greek, which Mark wrote this in Greek. It's possible that Peter wanted it translated into Greek as he was saying it. We don't know this. What we do know is that Mark followed Peter and wrote what Peter said. So which makes people say, oh, well, Peter was an illiterate fisherman then. Okay. But that doesn't go with your argument that an illiterate fisherman couldn't have written the New Testament, because Mark wrote what Peter said. Illiterate doesn't mean Peter can't talk. It just means he can't read or write, if that's the case. Because once again, Peter was a Jewish child growing up and may have memorized the whole, first 5 books of the Old Testament. Luke, Matthew, Mark, Luke was a medical doctor. Let's just go ahead and say not illiterate. But Luke wrote Luke and Acts. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then Acts is down here. John is in there. We're going to come to him in just a second. So once again, let's just assume a medical doctor, probably not illiterate. Also not a fisherman. Anyway, so jumping beyond John for a minute is James, the book of James. James was the half-brother of Jesus. Remember, his father was Joseph. Jesus' father was not Joseph. But Jesus quoted the Old Testament a lot in the 4 Gospels. Now, unless you're willing to admit that Jesus was God in the flesh, and of course knew the Old Testament, if you want to say he was just simply a regular man, then you've got to say that he was raised by Joseph and Mary and taught the Old Testament just like a Jewish child was. So why wouldn't James have been as well? He was his brother. They grew up in the same house. I don't know. It just sounds plausible to me that if they taught Jesus, they taught James. There we go. Paul. So now we're going to Paul. Like I said, we're going to jump over John for a minute. Paul is credited to writing 13 of the 27 New Testament books. Paul was a Pharisee, a religious leader, also having grown up as a Jewish child, memorizing the first 5. But if he continued to go on to the Pharisee status, surely he moved beyond the first 5 and learned a lot more. But he also wrote through Scribes sometimes. But when he did, he said so. And most likely it's because he was inside a prison and calling it out through the bars or through the window. Hey, write this to this, these people, this letter to these people. So there's no evidence there that he'd be illiterate. There's more evidence that he's not illiterate. And if you say, well, why did he write through a scribe? Well, he was in prison a great amount of time, in jail a great amount of time, and people followed him. So it's possible that they said, what do you want us to do? And he said, well, hey, why don't you write this letter for me while I'm stuck in here? Write this letter, mail it, take it to these people for me, or send it to these people. So that's highly likely, since we know that happened. So that was 13 of 27. So now we're at 19. We just covered basically 19 of the 27 books of the Old Testament, New Testament, new, not old. That's a different video. But now we're to John. Okay, now John is credited with the book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelations, 5 of them. Now John Yes, was a fisherman. He was one of the sons of Zebedee. There was another James, not James, half-brother of Jesus, another James. James and John were the sons of Zebedee. I'm not sure that's why that's referenced that way, but they were the sons of Zebedee. Zebedee was, a big enough name apparently to throw it out there, but there's no evidence that he was illiterate, just that he was a fisherman. You could say, well, why would a fisherman need to learn to read and write? Possible, but also John was raised as a Jewish child. So if they followed typical Jewish tradition, and understand, this is not just something they just did because it was a cool thing to do. This was their religious beliefs, their staunch religious beliefs, to memorize those first 5. So no evidence that John is illiterate, but also no evidence that he wasn't, but strong possible circumstantial evidence that he could read and write. Let's see. So that brings us to Jude. Jude, also known as Thaddeus, he was a disciple, but he was also a farmer. No evidence that he was illiterate, but no evidence that he was literate, other than the fact that he was a Jewish child. So that gives us 24 of the 27 New Testament books. Now we're at Hebrews. Now we don't know for sure, but Hebrews is traditionally accredited to Paul, but we don't know that for sure. And we're willing to say, hey, we're not certain, so we'll leave that open. We don't know. So, and that's, to be fair, we don't. And instead of saying, oh no, we're going to stick to our guns, it was Paul, I think it's fair for us to say we're not sure, and we're going to admit that, But we don't know that Paul did write Hebrews or not. We don't know. But what we do know is we can't say that if it wasn't Paul, that the person who wrote it is illiterate, because we don't know. So that's not fair to say, right? So, and then of course there's 1st and 2nd Peter. We do not know that Peter wrote those either. If Peter did, and if Mark was his scribe, then Peter apparently wrote this through a scribe, meaning it was a person who wrote what Peter told him to say, if that's the case. If not, we most certainly can't say that it was written by somebody who was illiterate, because clearly it was written. So, not illiterate, but we don't know that Peter was literate or not. We don't know. We just know that he was raised as a Jewish child. That's all we know. So, this is a fun fact, though. Out of all the 12 disciples, guess how many were fishermen? Anybody know? Ready? This many, this many, this many, this many. 4. Just 4. Andrew, James, and John, those that were sons of Zebedee, we said, and Peter. Those are the only ones that were fishermen. There were 8 others. There were disciples. And, like I said, Matthew was a tax collector. So we don't know. These people are illiterate. We just don't know. Just because you assume that a fisherman wouldn't need to read and write doesn't mean that they didn't learn to read and write. But also, we've covered how they could have been written, because it's a common thing back then for a scribe to write for someone. People still mailed letters. They're like, oh, I can't read and write, so I guess I won't now mail no letters to nobody. They still sent letters. So somebody had to do it. It was a common job for somebody who could read and write. Say, hey, you want to pay me? I'll write letters for you. So, and we know that's what Mark did for Peter. Whether Peter's illiterate or not, we know that Mark wrote those things. So, this is not something that I made this up. You can go read this yourself, assuming you're not an illiterate fisherman. But I know that I'm not illiterate. All I am, and you know it, is a wicked man. See you next time.